Officer Jake Miller never imagined another Tuesday shift would end with the silence of a tomb. The precinct basement was always a place of quiet neglect, a concrete catacomb filled with the ghosts of forgotten cases, and the metallic scent of aging evidence. For his K9 partner, Rex, it was usually just a final, perfunctory walkthrough before heading home. Rex, a magnificent German shepherd whose muzzle was now more silver than black, moved with the stoic grace of a veteran who had seen it all. But tonight, that stoicism had shattered. It began with a low growl, a vibration that traveled up the leash and into Jake's wrist like a current of unease. He stopped, his boots scuffing on the dusty floor. The only light came from a single, buzzing fluorescent tube that cast long, distorted shadows from rows of identical metal lockers. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "Probably just a rat." Rex ignored him. His attention was laser-focused on one particular locker, at the far end of the row, number 73. It was rust-streaked and dented, its grey paint flaking like sunburnt skin. It looked like it hadn't been opened since the station was built. The dog took a hesitant step forward, then another, his body coiled tight as a spring. The growl deepened, morphing into a sharp, insistent bark that echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space. Jake tugged on the leash. "Rex, leave it. Come on, home time." But the dog was rooted to the spot, his powerful legs braced against the concrete. The barking intensified, each concussive sound a demand. It wasn't his suspect-located bark, a sound of aggressive authority. This was different. It was frantic, laced with a strange, high-pitched note of desperation. It was a sound Jake hadn't heard in their 8 years together. He sighed, the weariness of a long shift settling deep into his bones. "What is it, huh? What have you got?" He walked toward the locker, his footsteps unnaturally loud. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, grimy surface, peering at the simple, keyless lock, rusted shut with age. He sniffed the air around the ventilation slits. Nothing. Just the smell of dust and old metal. "There's nothing here, bud. See?" He tried to pull Rex away again, more forcefully this time. The dog resisted, digging his claws into the floor with a scraping sound that set Jake's teeth on edge. And then, the barking stopped. It was replaced by a sound that made the hairs on Jake's arms stand up. A whine. A long, mournful, heartbreaking cry that seemed to come from the deepest part of the animal's soul. Rex pressed his nose against the cold metal door, his entire body trembling. It wasn't the sound of a police dog on a scent. It was the sound of grief. Jake knelt, his own concern finally overriding his fatigue. He looked from the dog's pleading, amber eyes to the impassive face of the locker. What could possibly be in there to provoke such a raw, emotional reaction from a hardened police K9? He knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that this was no rat. This was something else entirely. What that dog sensed was not a crime, but a tragedy. An opening that locker would unearth a secret the station had held, silent and unknowable, for decades. If you've ever trusted an animal's instinct over your own logic, you know the feeling that was beginning to dawn on Officer Miller. Stay with us to discover the truth hidden inside Locker 73, a truth so profound it would change the heart of an entire precinct. The sound of the whining drew the attention of Sergeant Davies, a man whose patience was as thin as his hairline. He appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his silhouette framed by the brighter light of the ground floor. "Miller. What's all the racket?" "Control your dog." Jake stood up, still holding the leash taut. Rex continued to keen softly, his nose pressed firmly to the locker. "It's Rex, Sarge." He's fixated on this old locker. Davies descended the stairs with a heavy sigh, his face a mask of weary disapproval. He glanced at the dog, then at the locker, and scoffed. "Locker 73. Miller, that thing hasn't been opened in 30 years. It's empty. It's been empty since before you were a rookie." "He won't leave it, sir. "I've never seen him like this. He's getting old, Jake," Davies said, his tone softening slightly, but still dismissive. "Maybe his wires are getting crossed. Happens to the best of them. Happens to us, too." He clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Just get him out of here. The night shift is trying to get some paperwork done." Jake felt a prickle of defensive anger. Rex wasn't just getting old, he was the most reliable partner Jake had ever had. His instincts had saved Jake's life on 2 separate occasions, once from a hidden gunman, and once from a collapsed floor in a derelict building. To dismiss his behavior as canine senility felt like a betrayal. "With all due respect, Sarge, he's not senile. He's on to something." Davies's face hardened again. "On to what?" "Dust bunnies. The ghost of evidence past. There are no records for that locker. It's not in the system. As far as this precinct is concerned, it doesn't exist. Now, are you going to get your dog, or do I have to make it an order?" The finality in his voice was unmistakable. Jake looked at Rex, whose body was still quivering with a strange, urgent energy. The dog's eyes met his, and in them, Jake saw not confusion, but an unwavering, desperate certainty. It was a look that said, "You have to believe me." Jake gave the leash a gentle but firm tug. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with a conflict he couldn't explain. "Let's go." Rex resisted for a moment longer, letting out one last, pleading whimper before finally, reluctantly, allowing himself to be led away. As they climbed the stairs, the sound of his claws clicking on the concrete steps felt like a countdown. Leaving the basement felt wrong. It felt like walking away from a victim. It felt like abandoning his partner. Upstairs, the familiar, controlled chaos of the precinct did little to soothe Jake's disquiet. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. A couple of younger officers, O'Malley and Chen, glanced over as he walked Rex toward the side exit. O'Malley smirked. "Heard the old man was throwing a fit downstairs, Miller. Finally lose his marbles." Jake's grip tightened on the leash. "His fine." Davies said he was barking at an empty locker, Chen added, trying to stifle a laugh. "Maybe he smells donuts from 1985, the casual mockery grated on Jake's nerves more than a direct insult. They saw Rex as a tool, an aging piece of equipment that was starting to malfunction. They didn't see the intelligence in his eyes, the deep, unspoken bond that had been forged in years of shared danger and absolute trust. He didn't bother to respond. He just led Rex outside into the cool night air. The city lights painted the sky in a hazy orange glow. Rex immediately turned and looked back at the station door, whining softly. Jake knelt beside him, stroking the thick fur on his neck. "I know, boy. I know you think something's in there." The dog leaned into his touch, but his gaze remained fixed on the building. Jake's mind raced. What could it be? The most logical, police-minded explanation was contraband. Maybe some officer decades ago had stashed a bag of dope, or an unregistered weapon, and then got transferred, fired, or worse. The scent could have degraded over time, becoming something strange and unrecognizable that was setting Rex off. But that didn't explain the whining. It didn't explain the overwhelming sense of sorrow that seemed to pour off his partner. Rex was trained to be aggressive with contraband scents, to be excited. This was the opposite of excitement. This was pain. He spent the next hour at home trying to forget about it. He filled Rex's food bowl, but the dog just nudged it with his nose and then lay down by the door, staring into the distance. Jake tried watching TV, but the meaningless chatter of the late-night shows couldn't penetrate the nagging question in his mind. He kept seeing the image of Rex, trembling, pressing himself against that cold, rusty door. He thought about Sergeant Davies's words. "It's empty." How could he be so sure? An unassigned, unrecorded locker was a loose end, and cops hated loose ends. He pulled out his laptop, and logged into the precinct's archaic records database. He typed in Locker 73, as Davies had predicted. The search yielded no results. He tried cross-referencing old evidence logs from the 1980s, looking for any mention of the basement storage area. He found hundreds of entries, a digital graveyard of old crimes, but nothing that pointed to that specific locker. It was a ghost in the machine. Frustrated, he slammed the laptop shut. Maybe Davies was right. Maybe he was overtired, and Rex was just having an off night. He should just go to bed, let it go. But he couldn't. He looked over at Rex, who had not moved from his spot by the door. The dog's breathing was shallow, and every few minutes, a low, guttural whine would escape his throat. It was the sound of a vigil. Whatever was in that locker, Rex was standing guard over it, even from miles away. The loyalty, the sheer, stubborn devotion of it, struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. He had asked Rex to trust him in countless life-or-death situations. The dog had never hesitated, not once. Now, his partner was asking the same of him. How could he refuse? A decision began to crystallize in his mind, a reckless, career-endangering decision. He wasn't going to let it go. He was going to open that locker. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to. For Rex. He stood up and grabbed his car keys. "All right, boy," he said, his voice quiet but firm with new resolve. "Let's go back. Let's go see this through." Rex was on his feet in an instant, his tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the doorframe. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of the fire Jake knew so well. They were a team. And their work for the night wasn't done yet. The precinct was quieter now, populated only by the skeletal night shift crew. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Jake strode through the main hall with a sense of purpose that bordered on defiance. He kept Rex on a short leash, a silent signal that this was business. The officer at the front desk, a rookie named Peterson, looked up from his phone, startled. "Miller. Thought you went home hours ago." "Forgot something," Jake said, his tone clipped, offering no room for conversation. He didn't break his stride, heading directly for the basement stairs. He could feel Peterson's curious gaze on his back. Down in the basement, the air was even colder and more still than before. The faulty light still flickered, casting the rows of lockers in a strobe-like, unsettling rhythm. Rex, now off-leash, trotted directly to Locker 73, bypassing all the others as if they were invisible. He didn't bark this time. He sat, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the rusted lock, a silent, implacable sentinel. It was even more unnerving than the barking. Jake stood beside him, a heavy mag light in his hand. He ran its powerful beam over the locker door, examining every inch of it. The lock was an old combination model, the dial frozen in place by layers of rust and grime. There was no keyhole, no simple way in. It would have to be forced. His first thought was to find the official bolt cutters from the station's maintenance closet. But that would require a logbook entry and a reason he didn't have and that Sergeant Davies had already rejected. Taking them without permission would be a serious breach of protocol. It could mean a suspension, or worse. He was a man who had built his entire life on rules and procedures. For a moment, he hesitated. The weight of his career, his pension, his reputation, pressed down on him. Was he really going to risk it all for a dog's hunch? He looked down at Rex. The dog hadn't moved a muscle. He was a statue of pure conviction. The image of the younger officers laughing, of Davies's patronizing dismissal, flashed through his mind. They saw an old dog. Jake saw a lifetime of unwavering loyalty. The choice became simple. Loyalty had to be a two-way street. He made his way to the maintenance room. The door was locked, as expected. But Jake had been in this precinct for 25 years. He knew its secrets. He knew that the lock on the maintenance room was old and finicky. He pulled a thin metal shim from his wallet, a tool he technically wasn't supposed to have, and slid it into the gap between the door and the frame. A few seconds of practiced manipulation, a soft click, and the door swung open. Inside, hanging on a designated hook, were a pair of heavy-duty, 2-foot bolt cutters. They felt impossibly heavy in his hands, each pound a measure of the line he was about to cross. He carried them back to the basement, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The precinct was silent around him, but in his ears, the silence was a roaring accusation. Rex looked up as he approached, a soft thump of his tail on the concrete acknowledging the tool in Jake's hands. He seemed to understand. Jake positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters around the thick, rusted shackle of the lock. He took a deep breath, the cold, dusty air filling his lungs. This was it. The point of no return. He squeezed the handles. The metal groaned in protest, but the rust was too thick. It wouldn't give. He repositioned, planting his feet, and put his entire body weight into it. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed. He was no longer a young man, and the effort was immense. With a final, desperate heave, there was a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. The shackle snapped. The broken lock fell to the floor with a metallic clang, leaving a small cloud of rust dust hanging in the air. For a moment, Jake just stood there, breathing heavily, the bolt cutters hanging limply in his hand. The silence that followed was profound, heavier than before. Rex rose to his feet, whining softly, his body tense with anticipation. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the locker handle. It was cold, so cold. He pulled. The door, sealed shut by decades of rust and settled grime, resisted. It scraped and groaned, a sound like a coffin being opened. He had to brace his foot against the adjacent locker and pull with all his remaining strength. With a final, shuddering screech, the door swung open. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the smell of decay or drugs he had half expected. It was faint, achingly familiar, yet impossible to place. It was the scent of dust, of old paper, of fabric that had been stored for a lifetime. And underneath it all, something else. Something clean and gentle. Like baby powder and faded lavender. His eyes adjusted to the darkness inside. The locker wasn't empty. On the single shelf sat a small, dark green canvas duffel bag. It was military style, the kind cops and soldiers used to carry. It was covered in a thick layer of grey dust, but otherwise seemed perfectly intact. Rex pushed past him, his nose twitching, and began sniffing the bag with an intensity that was almost reverent. He didn't try to paw at it or tear it open. He just smelled it, his tail giving a slow, almost sorrowful wag. Jake's heart hammered against his chest. This was the moment of truth. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the dusty canvas. The bag was light. He carefully lifted it out and placed it on the floor in the beam of his mag light. The zipper was stiff, but it moved under his determined pull. He unzipped the bag slowly, the sound tearing through the silent basement. He peeled back the top flap. His breath caught in his throat. The entire precinct, the entire world, seemed to fall away, leaving only him, his dog, and the impossible contents of the bag. The whole station would soon fall silent, but for now, the only sound was the frantic beating of Jake's own heart. Inside the bag, nestled in the center, was a bundle wrapped in a faded, pale blue baby blanket. The fabric was worn soft with time, and a small, embroidered duckling was visible in one corner. Jake's hands, usually so steady, trembled as he reached for it. He gently unfolded the blanket. What lay within made no sense. It was a police uniform. A perfect, miniature replica of the department's dress blues, so small it would fit a 1-year-old child. The fabric was immaculate, the creases still sharp. Pinned to the tiny jacket was a small, Hand-carved wooden badge, shaped like a shield. Burned into the wood was a single name, Daniel. Beneath the uniform was a small, leather-bound photo album. Jake picked it up, his thumb stroking the worn cover before opening it. The first page held a single photograph. A young, smiling police officer, his face bright with a joy so pure it was almost painful to look at, was holding a newborn baby swaddled in the same pale blue blanket. The officer looked impossibly young, maybe 22 or 23, with a shock of dark hair and proud, happy eyes. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, were the words, "Michael and his boy, Daniel. Our future partner, Michael." The name didn't ring a bell. Jake carefully turned the page. There were more photos. The baby in a crib. The baby being held by a smiling young woman, presumably his mother. A picture of the tiny uniform laid out on a bed, as if waiting to be worn. The last page of the album was empty, a stark, blank square that felt like a slammed door. Tucked into the back pocket of the album was a thick bundle of letters, tied together with a simple piece of twine. They were addressed to Officer Michael Peterson, at the precinct's address. Jake looked at the name again. Peterson. The same last name as the rookie at the front desk. A coincidence? He untied the twine. The letters were from Michael's wife, written during his shifts. They were filled with the mundane, beautiful details of new parenthood. Daniel smiled for the first time today. "I think he has your eyes. He kept grabbing for your badge while you were sleeping. He's going to be just like his daddy. I miss you. Come home safe." The last letter was different. The handwriting was shaky, tear-blotched. They said it was sudden. No warning. The doctors don't know why. "Our baby is gone, Michael. Our little boy is gone. I don't know how we are going to live." A cold dread washed over Jake. He looked back into the duffel bag. Beneath where the blanket had been, there was one more item. A folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age. He carefully unfolded it. The headline read, "Local hero officer killed in line of duty." The date was from October 1985. The article described how Officer Michael Peterson, while responding to a robbery in progress, had been fatally wounded. It mentioned he was a decorated officer and a former K-9 handler, survived by his grieving wife. It also noted, in a single, devastating line, that his death came just 1 week after the tragic loss of his infant son, Daniel, to SIDS. The breath left Jake's body in a rush. The locker wasn't a hiding place for contraband. It was a shrine. A memorial created by a shattered father for his lost son, a time capsule of love and grief that had been sealed away and forgotten after his own untimely death. The little uniform wasn't for a living child. It was for a dream that had died. Suddenly, the commotion upstairs, the sounds of shouting and running feet, broke through his stunned silence. He had been discovered. Sergeant Davies appeared at the top of the stairs, his face thunderous, flanked by O'Malley and Chen. "Miller. I knew it. I heard that noise. What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He stormed down the stairs, stopping short when he saw the broken lock and the open locker. His eyes fell to the floor, to the tiny uniform, the photo album, the letters spread out in the beam of the flashlight. His anger evaporated, replaced by a stunned, confused silence. O'Malley and Chen peered over his shoulder, their earlier mockery gone, their faces pale. The basement, which had been filled with the echoes of Jake's actions, was now utterly, completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was Rex's soft, slow breathing as he lay his head down next to the pale blue blanket, as if he were finally able to rest. The silence spread. The rookie, Peterson, drawn by the commotion, came to the top of the stairs. "Sarge? Is everything okay?" Davies didn't answer. He just knelt slowly, his knees cracking, and reached a trembling hand toward the tiny wooden badge. "Michael," he whispered, his voice choked with a disbelief that spanned 3 decades. "I don't believe it." The whole station was falling silent, one officer at a time, as the story of a forgotten grief began to unravel in the dusty, neglected heart of the building. And in that shared, heavy silence, they were all connected not as cops, but as human beings, bearing witness to a love that had refused to be forgotten. The silence in the basement was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, absorbing the hum of the lights, the distant city sounds, the very breath of the men who stood there. Sergeant Davies remained kneeling, his hand hovering over the little wooden badge, his face a mixture of shock and dawning, painful recognition. "Michael Peterson," he said again, his voice raspy. "He was my training officer when I was a rookie." O'Malley and Chen exchanged wide-eyed glances. The name, the story, was from a generation before theirs. It was precinct mythology, a ghost story. But here was the proof, laid bare on the grimy concrete floor. The rookie, Peterson, slowly descended the stairs, his eyes fixed on the scene. "What is it, Sarge? Who's Michael Peterson?" Davies looked up, his eyes glassy. He was your uncle, kid. Your dad's older brother." The rookie froze mid-step, his face draining of color. My uncle. My dad never talks about him. He just said he was a cop who died a long time ago." "People stopped talking about it," Davies said, his gaze returning to the heart-wrenching display. "It was too much. First the baby, then him, all in 1 week. It broke this place for a while. It broke his family. Your father was just a teenager." He finally picked up the wooden badge, turning it over and over in his palm. "Michael carved this himself. He was always whittling something. He showed it to me the day Daniel was born. He said, one day, he'll wear a real one, but this is his starter badge." The story began to pour out of Davies, the words rusty from decades of disuse. He told them about Michael Peterson, the golden boy of the precinct. A cop's cop, brave, kind, and the first officer in their department to successfully establish a full-time K-9 program. He was a legend in the making. Then he and his wife, Sarah, had Daniel. The joy in the precinct was palpable. Michael was on top of the world. Then came the phone call in the middle of the night. The incomprehensible tragedy of SIDS. "Michael was a ghost after that," Davies said, his voice low. "He came back to work, but he wasn't here. He'd just stare off into space. We all tried to talk to him, but it was like he was behind a wall of glass." His wife, Sarah, had gone to stay with her parents. He was alone. He gestured to the locker. This was a spare, one of the old ones nobody used. He must have put this all in here. His shrine to his boy. A week later, he responded to that robbery call. The report said he didn't wait for backup. He went in alone. Some said it was bravery. The rest of us, we always suspected he had a death wish. He left a hole in this precinct that never really got filled." The rookie, young Peterson, sank down onto the bottom step, his face in his hands. "My God. My dad never told me any of this." "Some grief is too big for words," Davies said softly. He looked at Jake, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a weary, profound understanding. "You broke protocol, Miller. You broke into station property. I should write you up for a dozen violations." He paused, looking down at Rex, who hadn't moved from his spot beside the blanket. "But how did the dog know? What did he smell?" Jake finally found his voice, though it felt distant. "I don't know. Cadaver scent, maybe. But it's been over 30 years. There's nothing organic here." It was then that an old, stooped figure appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Jimmy, the retired janitor, who sometimes came by at night to play cards with the dispatchers. He was nearly 80, his memory a patchwork of clarity and fog, but he had worked in this building for 50 years. Heard a boom, Jimmy said, his voice thin and reedy. Thought the boiler finally gave up the ghost. His eyes scanned the scene, and a flicker of ancient memory lit his face. He pointed a trembling finger at the open locker. That's Mikey's locker. Davies looked at him, surprised. You remember this, Jimmy? Sure, Jimmy said, shuffling down a few steps. After he was gone, the captain told me to clear out his locker. But when I opened it, I saw what was inside. The little uniform, the pictures. I couldn't do it. I couldn't just throw it in a box and send it to his poor wife. Not then. So I moved it all. I put it from his locker upstairs into this one down here. Put a new lock on it. I figured one day someone would come for it. Someone who was ready. He looked at the contents on the floor. I guess I just forgot to tell anyone. Then I got old. And I just plain forgot. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place, but the central mystery remained. Jake looked at Rex, who finally lifted his head and let out a soft waff. His eyes were on the pale blue blanket. Jake reached out and carefully picked it up. It was impossibly soft. As he held it, a different scent, one that had been hiding beneath the layers of dust and lavender, finally reached him. It was faint, almost undetectable to a human nose, but it was there. It was animal. Musky, familiar. The scent of a dog. He looked from the blanket to Davies. You said Michael was a K9 handler. The first 1 inch. That's right, Davies confirmed. Had a partner named Saber. A huge, beautiful shepherd. Inseparable, the two of them. The truth hit Jake with the force of a lightning strike. A revelation so strange and beautiful it seemed impossible. He looked at Rex, then back at the blanket. When the baby died, Jake began, his voice filled with awe. Michael was grieving. But he wasn't alone. His dog, Saber, he would have been grieving with him. A dog knows when its family is in pain. Michael must have held this blanket, cried into it. And Saber would have been right there with him. Lying with the blanket, trying to comfort his partner. His scent, Saber's scent, would have been all over it. The scent of AK-9's grief. The scent of his loyalty. The men were silent, processing the incredible implication. That's what Rex smells, Jake continued, his voice cracking with emotion. He's not smelling death. He's not smelling drugs. He's smelling the ghost of a fellow officer. The echo of AK-9's sorrow and devotion, trapped in the fibers of this blanket for 35 years. He wasn't barking at a locker. He was answering a call from a brother he never knew. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer heavy with shock, but filled with a sense of wonder, of reverence. They were standing on hallowed ground. Young Peterson looked up, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't a cop in that moment, just a boy who had just met the uncle he never knew, through the most impossible of messengers. Rex stood up, walked over to the young officer, and gently licked the tears from his cheek. The cycle of comfort, begun by a dog named Saber 3 decades ago, was finally complete. The story of Locker 73 spread through the precinct like wildfire. The night shift passed it to the day shift, the whispers traveling from the squad cars to the detective's bullpen to the captain's office. By morning, the entire station was abuzz, not with the usual gossip, but with a hushed, somber reverence. The basement was no longer a place of neglect. It became a quiet, unofficial pilgrimage site. Officers, one by one, would walk down the concrete stairs to look at the open locker, to see the small shrine that Jake had carefully placed back inside on a clean cloth. They would stand there for a moment in silence, their faces etched with a complex mix of sorrow and wonder, before turning and leaving without a word. The locker had become more than just a piece of metal. It was a testament to a love that had outlasted death, and a loyalty that had transcended time. Captain Miller, no relation to Jake, called Jake and Sergeant Davies into his office. The bolt cutters sat on the edge of his desk, a silent indictment. Jake stood straight, ready to accept the consequences of his actions. He had broken the rules, and he would not make excuses. The captain, a formidable man with a stern reputation, looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. "You disobeyed a direct order from your supervising officer, Miller," he began, his voice a low growl. "You broke into station property. You acted recklessly and without authorization. By the book, I should suspend you for a month." He paused, picking up the small, hand-carved wooden badge that now sat beside the bolt cutters. He turned it over in his fingers, his expression softening. "But the book doesn't have a chapter for this." He looked from Jake to Davies. "I've been on the phone all morning with the deputy chief. I also spoke to a man named David Peterson. He's a firefighter over in the 5th District. He cried for 10 minutes straight. Said his nephew, the rookie, called him at 3 a.m. and told him the whole story." The captain placed the badge gently back on his desk. "David is Michael's younger brother. He's coming down this afternoon to collect his brother's things. Things he never knew existed." He looked directly at Jake, and for the first time, Jake saw not a commander, but just a man, humbled and deeply moved. "What you did was wrong, procedurally. But what your dog did, what he led you to do, it was profoundly right. It healed a wound this department didn't even know it still had." He slid the bolt cutters off his desk and into a trash can with a decisive thud. "There will be no official report. This incident never happened. As for Locker 73, it's being retired. Permanently. We are going to mount a memorial plaque for Officer Michael Peterson and his son, Daniel, in the main lobby. It's long overdue." Relief washed over Jake, so potent it almost buckled his knees. But it was more than just relief. It was validation. He looked at Davies, who gave him a slow, respectful nod. The barrier between them, the tension from the night before, had vanished. They were united by the shared experience. Later that afternoon, a quiet, powerfully built man in his late 40s with kind, sad eyes walked into the precinct. It was David Peterson. The rookie stood beside him, his hand on his uncle's shoulder. Captain Miller and Jake led them down to the basement. When David saw the contents of the locker, his composure broke. He sank to his knees and gently touched the tiny uniform, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wasn't just mourning a brother he'd lost as a teenager, he was mourning the nephew he'd never met, and the future they had all been robbed of. Jake and the captain stepped back, giving the family their space. Rex, who had been sitting quietly by Jake's side, seemed to sense what was needed. He walked over to the kneeling man and rested his heavy head on his shoulder. David looked up, startled, and then wrapped an arm around the dog's neck, burying his face in Rex's thick fur. The dog stood perfectly still, a solid, comforting presence in a storm of grief. He was so proud, David finally managed to say, his voice muffled. So proud of his boy. And his dog. He loved his K9, Saber, more than anything. When the baby died, Sarah told me later that Saber wouldn't leave Michael's side. He'd lay his head on Michael's lap for hours while Michael just held that blue blanket and stared at the wall. The dog was the only one who could reach him. He looked at Rex, then at Jake, his eyes filled with a dawning, tearful understanding. It was Saber's scent, wasn't it? That's what your dog found. Jake nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. We think so. David carefully, reverently, began to pack the items back into the duffel bag. He folded the tiny uniform with painstaking care. He wrapped the letters and the photo album in the blue blanket. He held the bag as if it were the most precious object in the world. As he stood to leave, he turned to Jake. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick. For 35 years, my brother has just been a sad story, a name on a wall. You and your partner, you gave him back to us. You gave us back his heart. That evening, Jake didn't go straight home. He drove to a quiet park overlooking the city, the one where he and Rex often ended their shifts. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. Rex sat beside him on the grass, leaning his weight against Jake's leg. Jake looked down at his partner, at the grey fur around his wise, amber eyes. He thought of the mockery from the night before, the dismissals, his own initial doubt. He felt a profound sense of shame, followed by an even more profound sense of gratitude. This animal, this creature of instinct and unwavering heart, had seen something no human could. He hadn't just solved a mystery, he had mended a broken family, honored a fallen hero, and reminded an entire precinct what it truly meant to serve and protect, not just the living, but the memory of those who had been lost. He had reminded Jake what it meant to have faith. "You're a good boy, Rex," Jake whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head. "You're the best there is." Rex looked up at him, his tail thumping softly on the grass, as if to say, "I know. We are a team." The bond between them, already strong, had been reforged into something sacred, something unbreakable, in the dusty silence of a forgotten basement. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but significant shift occurred within the precinct. The story of Michael Peterson, Daniel, and the K-9 who remembered, became a new kind of cornerstone for the department's culture. The cynicism that often coated the walls like a layer of grime seemed a little thinner. Officers looked at the K-9 unit with a new level of respect, not just as tools, but as partners with an intuition that sometimes surpassed human understanding. The memorial plaque was mounted in the lobby, just as the captain had promised. It was simple and elegant, made of polished brass. It bore the names of Officer Michael Peterson and his son, Daniel, with the dates of their short lives. Below their names was an etching of a police shield nestled beside a German shepherd, and a single line, "Loyalty, love, and memory endure." Every officer who walked past it, rookie or veteran, would pause for a moment. It was a silent, daily ritual of remembrance. The rookie, Peterson, whose name was now forever linked to this legacy, seemed to walk a little taller. He had found a connection to the heroic uncle he'd never known, and a deeper understanding of the sacrifices his own family had endured. He often stopped by the K-9 kennels just to see Rex, bringing him a chew toy, or just spending a few minutes stroking his fur, a quiet thank you that needed no words. For Jake, the change was internal and profound. The weariness that had settled in his bones for years had lifted. The thought of retirement, which had been a comforting beacon on the horizon, now seemed like a distant, unappealing shore. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a recommitment to the job that went beyond just putting in his time. He saw his role not just as an enforcer of laws, but as a guardian of stories, a listener for the voiceless. His partnership with Rex had deepened into something that felt almost telepathic. He trusted the dog's every twitch, every low growl, every subtle shift in posture, with an absolute faith he had previously reserved only for his own two eyes. One evening, about a month after the discovery, Jake was finishing his shift when Sergeant Davies approached him. He was holding a small, framed photograph. "The captain and I were cleaning out some old files in the archive," he said, handing it to Jake. "We found this. Thought you should have it." Jake looked at the picture. It was a black and white photo from the mid-1980s. A young, smiling Michael Peterson was kneeling on the grass, his arm around his K-9 partner, Saber. The dog was magnificent, the spitting image of a younger Rex, his head cocked with an alert intelligence, his eyes full of devotion for the man beside him. It was a portrait of a perfect partnership. "There's a resemblance, isn't there?" Davies said quietly. Jake nodded, unable to speak. The connection felt tangible, a direct line drawn through time from that dog to his own. He took the photo home and placed it on his mantelpiece, right next to a picture of him and Rex, taken on the day they had graduated from the K-9 Academy. The two partnerships, separated by decades, now stood side by side. He realized that what Rex had sensed in that basement wasn't just the smell of another dog. It was the scent of a shared identity, a common bond of service and love that was encoded in their very DNA. Saber had mourned his partner, and the child his partner had lost. His grief, his loyalty, had left an indelible mark, a chemical signature on a piece of cloth. And 35 years later, Rex, his descendant in spirit if not in blood, had recognized it. He had recognized the call of a brother. The experience taught Jake that the most important clues in life are rarely the ones you can bag and tag as evidence. They are the emotions, the connections, the invisible threads that bind people, and animals, together across generations. He had been a good cop for 25 years. But after the lesson of Locker 73, he finally felt like he was becoming a wise one. He understood that true justice wasn't just about catching criminals. It was also about finding lost souls and bringing them home. And sometimes, all it took was listening to the insistent bark of a faithful old dog, who remembered a sorrow the world had long since forgotten. The world is full of locked rooms and forgotten stories. It's easy to walk past them, to dismiss the strange instincts that tell us to stop and pay attention. But every now and then, a heart loyal enough, a spirit brave enough, refuses to walk by. What began as an old dog's strange fixation on a rusty locker became a lesson in the enduring power of love and the echoes it leaves behind. It transformed a jaded officer, healed a broken family, and honored a forgotten hero. Officer Miller and Rex continued to serve together for 2 more years, their bond a quiet legend in the precinct. They were a reminder to everyone that the greatest partners are not the ones who think like you, but the ones who feel with you, the ones who can hear the whispers of the past and guide you toward the truths that matter most. The final, peaceful image is of Jake, years later in his retirement, sitting on his porch with an aging, even grayer Rex lying at his feet. He holds the framed photo of Michael and Saber, his gaze distant and reflective. He learned that day that you should always trust your partner, especially when they have 4 legs and a heart full of something you don't yet understand. Because sometimes, they see not what is there, but what is still there, waiting to be found.